You know what I hear from caregivers all the time? They say, Laura, I tried this routine that you're talking about and I set up a schedule. I organized everything perfectly and it lasted exactly 3 days before everything fell apart. And here's what I want you to know, it's not because you're doing anything wrong, and it's not because your person is being difficult. And it's definitely not because routines don't work in dementia care. The problem is that most of us, including myself, when I first started taking care of people with dementia, we jump straight into the what without understanding the why. We create these beautifully organized routines without first doing the one thing that makes everything else possible. And today, I want to talk about why routines fail in dementia care and the critical first step that changes everything. And I'd like to start with a story about a caregiver I'm working with. Her name is Margaret. She called absolutely overwhelmed. She'd been caring for her husband, Tom, at home, and everything was going great. And just like I said, everything would work for a few days, and then there was complete chaos. The morning routine started to fall apart first. The medication schedule became a battle. He was fighting her over every single medication, and I know you can relate to that. But then, even those simple things like getting dressed turned into hour-long struggles for her. And I know you can empathize with that type of frustration. And she said, "What am I missing, Laura?" And I could hear it in her voice, that familiar mix of overly frustrated and defeat. But here's what you might be missing, and Margaret too. Before you can create any routine that actually works, you have to understand your person's internal world. Because when we have dementia, our external world becomes confusing and unpredictable. But our internal world, our emotions, our physical sensations, our deep seated needs, those become more important. They become the compass of everything that guides what we're doing for them. So when Tom was fighting the morning routine, it wasn't because he was being stubborn and just trying to act out for her. His internal world was telling him something was wrong, something felt super unsafe, and something didn't make sense anymore. And until Margaret learned to read those signals, every routine was built on shifting sand. And if you've known me for any length of time, this is what I call meeting them where they're at. And it's super important because it's the foundation that everything else is going to stand on. I know some of you might be thinking, Laura, that sounds really nice, but how do I actually do that when my mom doesn't remember my name half of the time? And I get that. Fair question. And here's the thing, you don't need them to remember your name for this to work. You need to become the detective of their emotional and physical state. And I want to break this down into 3 things that you can start looking for starting today. First, I want you to watch their body language before the routine even starts. Are their shoulders tense? Are they fidgeting? Are they looking around the room like they're searching for something or someone? These are clues about their internal state that have nothing to do with their memory. And when I implemented this with Margaret and she started doing it with Tom, instead of launching into things like, okay, it's time for your pills, she'd spend about 30 seconds just observing him. Was he comfortable in his chair? Did he seem agitated or calm? Was he focused on something specific? And if he was, she didn't bother him at that moment. She gave him a few minutes because those pills didn't need to be given right then in those 10 seconds. She could give him some time to finish whatever he was doing. Second, I want you to notice what they're drawn to or what they naturally avoid. Because your person's brain might not remember the routine, but it absolutely remembers feelings. And if they keep avoiding the bathroom in the morning, there might be something about that space that just feels uncomfortable or unsafe. If they're drawn to sitting by the window, that might be where they feel the most grounded and the most comfortable and the most supported. I need you to take note of those things because they're super important. Tom, it turned out, was avoiding the kitchen in the mornings because the light was so bright and so overwhelming. But once we figured that out and we adjusted the lighting, suddenly everything for her got so much easier. And it was as simple as the lighting. Who knew? Third, I want you to start paying attention to the time of day when they seem most like themselves. I like to call this their golden hour, that window of time where their internal world feels most stable and most familiar to them. And for some people, this is the first thing in the morning. For others, it's mid afternoon. For Tom, it was actually around 10 o'clock. And this was after he'd been awake for a while and before the day got too overwhelming. And here's where things started to get simpler for Margaret. She discovered that when she started building routines around Tom's internal clock instead of fighting against it, she said she thought Tom was actually enjoying it and looking forward to the routine. What she said was instead of a battle over medications, it became a quiet moment that they were sharing together. And instead of struggling with getting dressed, it became a gentle, unhurried process that honored his peace and his comfort. But here's the thing that was most important to me. Margaret stopped feeling like she was failing because when you understand your person's internal world, and meet them where they are, you're not swimming upstream anymore. And now I want to be real with you for a minute because this isn't always easy. And I get that. Some days your person's internal world is going to be so stormy and so turbulent, no amount of understanding is going to make everything smooth. And that's okay because this is just part of the journey. But what I want you to hear is that instead of taking this personally, instead of thinking that you're failing or doing something wrong, I want you to start seeing the situation for what it is. And I want you to start to respond with compassion instead of frustration and give yourself some grace. You deserve this. And by understanding that, this is when that routine becomes flexible because you understand the person it's meant to serve. You're looking at them and you're looking for those clues. Just this morning, I got a text from Margaret and she said, Laura, I finally feel like I'm caring for my husband again, not just managing a to do list. And I want you to feel that way too, because that's what happens when you start with the person, not the plan. So listen, before you create your next routine, before you organize another schedule, take time to become a student of your person's internal world. I want you to start watching their body language. Notice what they're drawn to and what they're avoiding. Find that golden hour. Most importantly, I want you to meet them where they're at. And I want you to build the routine around that, their abilities, not their disabilities. And I know this feels like one more thing to try and figure out when you're already so overwhelmed. But here's what I've learned in all my years of walking alongside families through this journey. When you get the foundation right, everything else starts to become possible. The routines work because they're building on understanding and not just organizing. The days seem to flow just a little bit better because you're working with your person, not against them. And you get to feel like that loving caregiver that you've always been instead of feeling like constant failure and guilt that you're carrying around. Look, you're not feeling, you just needed to know where you needed to start. And if this resonates with you and you're tired of all your routines falling apart and you're ready to try something different, I want to hear from you in the comments below because it's so important to me. Tell me what's the one thing that you noticed about your person's internal world that you hadn't paid attention to before. Because when we start sharing all these observations and when we start seeing our people as a whole human with rich internal lives, that's where real caregiving begins. You don't have to figure this out alone. Your person deserves to be met where they are, and so do you. And until next week, I'll be here caring for you while you're caring for them. See you next week.